There's a version of San Francisco most people think they know, where the Mission District means murals, cafes, and late nights that feel easy, yet that picture leaves out what was happening on blocks like 16th and Valencia when things got tense. People heard stories about fights between girls from Potrero Hill and Valencia Gardens, but they treated it like noise, something small that would burn out on its own without turning serious. That assumption stayed in place until nights started ending with real consequences, where a car could slow down near a corner store and leave somebody bleeding before anyone even processed what just happened. And once people realized who was stepping out those cars, the story stopped sounding like rumors and started feeling like something organized. Because by the late 1980s, this was not about random arguments or isolated incidents anymore, since young women were moving with structure, carrying out actions that followed patterns instead of emotions. They were not reacting in the moment since they were planning ahead, watching movement, and choosing when to act, which made everything harder to track or explain from the outside. That shift did not happen overnight, and it did not start with one shooting or one fight that people could point to as the beginning. To understand how it reached that point, you have to go back before the headlines, before the names, into the neighborhoods that shaped everything that came after. San Francisco always had two versions living side by side, since the one shown to outsiders focused on downtown views, while another reality stayed locked inside housing projects like Valencia Gardens on 15th Street or Potrero Hill across the city. Those areas were not designed with violence in mind, yet the layout made movement easy through open walkways, connected courtyards, plus cut-through paths that let people move quick when trouble started. Valencia Gardens, built back in 1943 near 15th, and Valencia came with wide entry points plus long interior corridors, which later made it easier for dealers to set up spots that stayed hard for police to control. Potrero Hill, sitting up high with its terrace and annex sections, had tight streets mixed with blind corners, so anyone growing up there learned fast how to move without being seen when pressure came. By the late 1970s moving into the mid-80s, violence already had roots through male crews connected to areas like Hunters Point, Fillmore, or the Mission, where disputes over territory or money often turned physical real quick. Women inside those spaces were not leading anything at first, since they mostly handled support roles like holding product, keeping lookout, or providing cover when police rolled through looking for suspects. That setup created a system where men controlled money, status, plus decision-making, while women carried risk without getting the same respect or reward. Over time, that imbalance did not sit right with everyone, especially younger girls watching how things worked from the inside while taking notes on what could change. Growing up in those projects meant learning territory before learning anything else, since kids understood early which blocks felt safe or which corners could get you pressed if you walked wrong. Schools like Mission High or Balboa pulled students from different neighborhoods together, so tension sometimes followed them into hallways, which meant fights could start from small misunderstandings that carried deeper meaning tied to where someone lived. Public buses like the 14 Mission line forced people from different sides into the same space, so even a bump or wrong look could turn into something bigger if pride got involved. That constant awareness built a mindset where protection became personal, especially for girls who realized nobody else was stepping in when things got serious. As time moved deeper into the mid-80s, small groups of girls started forming tight circles that stayed loyal to each other, even if they were not yet structured like full crews with rules or ranks. These groups moved together at parties, at parks like Dolores or Garfield Square, plus at bus stops where confrontations could happen without warning. While they did not run operations yet, they already showed signs of coordination, since they backed each other up fast when problems started, which made others think twice before testing them. Older residents later remembered seeing these early cliques moving through Valencia Gardens or Potrero Hill, noticing how they carried themselves with more confidence compared to previous years. That shift did not happen overnight, since it built slowly through daily exposure to the same environment where survival meant adapting faster than the next person around you. Girls watched how men handled disputes, how territory got defended, plus how money flowed through certain apartments or corners, so over time they understood the system without needing anyone to explain it. Once that understanding settled in, the idea of staying in the background started fading, since some began thinking about running things on their own terms instead of playing supporting roles forever. That mindset was already forming before the real change came, which started when money entered the picture in a way that forced everybody to pick a side. By the time the mid-80s rolled in, crack cocaine hit San Francisco fast, moving through neighborhoods like Valencia Gardens, Potrero Hill, Hunters Point, plus the Mission District with a speed that caught everybody off guard. What started as small-time dealing turned into a steady system once demand jumped, So corners that barely mattered before suddenly became high-value spots controlled by whoever could hold them down. Men already connected to street networks stepped in first, setting up operations out of apartments or corners, while money started flowing in ways most residents had never seen before. That shift changed how people viewed the streets, since survival started linking directly to who controlled product, movement, plus distribution. Inside that system, women were still playing support roles at first, handling work that carried risk without real control over the outcome or profit. They held drugs when police pressure increased, transported packages between locations, plus stayed present during sales so operations could run smoother without interruption. When raids happened, they often took the fall, facing charges while men stayed removed from direct consequences, which built frustration that did not go away quietly. Over time, that frustration turned into awareness, since many started realizing that they understood the system just as well as the ones calling shots, yet were still treated like backup. That awareness reached a breaking point somewhere around 1984 into 1986, when women inside Potrero Hill began discussing how the setup worked against them, especially after repeated incidents where they carried legal risk without seeing equal benefit. Instead of continuing that pattern, a group of young African American women decided to move differently, choosing to cut men out of their immediate operations rather than keep playing a secondary role. That decision was not emotional or sudden, since it came from watching how money moved, how supply chains worked, plus how territory could be controlled if the right structure was in place. Once that shift happened, the foundation for something more organized started forming inside Potrero Hill. The group that emerged from that shift became known as the Potrero Hill Posse, often shortened to PHP, which was not just a loose circle of friends, but a structured crew with internal rules, roles, plus discipline that mirrored established street organizations. Membership was not open to just anybody, since most recruits had to be raised in Potrero Hill or closely tied to the area, while proving loyalty through actions rather than words. Inside the group, titles started forming, with positions like leaders handling decisions, enforcers maintaining order, plus others managing daily operations, which created a system where everyone knew their place. That structure gave them stability early, allowing them to operate with consistency rather than chaos, which made their presence stronger than typical street groups. Their operations centered around what people on the streets called rock houses, which were apartments converted into controlled environments where crack cocaine was cooked, packaged, then distributed through a steady rotation of workers. Each location had teams running shifts that covered different times of day, ensuring business never stopped while minimizing attention from law enforcement or rival groups. Women inside those spaces handled everything from production to sales, maintaining control over supply while keeping communication tight between different locations. Alongside drug operations, PHP also built boosting crews that moved through retail stores across San Francisco, entering in groups, collecting specific items, then leaving quickly before security could react, which added another stream of income. That level of organization gave PHP an edge, since they were not depending on one method to generate money, which allowed them to adapt quickly when pressure increased in one area. Money collected from these operations did not stay scattered, since contributions were pooled together into a shared fund used for bail, legal costs, plus supporting members when situations went left. That system built trust within the group, since everyone understood that loyalty came with protection, which made members more committed to keeping things running smoothly. Over time, that consistency built a reputation that extended beyond Potrero Hill, reaching nearby neighborhoods where people started hearing about a group of women running their own system without outside control. That reputation was not built through random acts of violence, since it came from how consistently they responded when challenged, making it clear that disrespect would be handled immediately without hesitation. People who moved through Potrero Hill started adjusting their behavior, avoiding certain actions that could bring unwanted attention, while others chose to stay out of their way entirely. Even male dealers in nearby areas sometimes avoided direct conflict, choosing instead to respect boundaries rather than risk escalation with a group that had already proven it could respond collectively. That shift in perception mattered, since power on the streets often came from how others viewed your ability to act, not just what you had already done. Still, growth like that never happens in isolation, since surrounding neighborhoods were watching closely, especially in places like Valencia Gardens, where similar conditions already existed. Early tension started building through small interactions, including arguments at parties, disagreements over territory, plus situations where individuals crossed into areas without understanding the implications. These moments did not immediately turn into large-scale conflict, yet they created friction that stayed unresolved, slowly building pressure between groups that were still defining their identities. Some of these clashes stayed physical but limited, involving fights or minor injuries, while others carried deeper meaning tied to respect, which made them harder to settle. At the same time, connections between Potrero Hill and other areas like the Mission District meant that movement between neighborhoods became more common, increasing the chances of encounters that could turn serious without warning. Women from PHP sometimes showed up in Valencia Gardens or surrounding blocks, either for business or social reasons, which tested how far they could move without facing resistance. On the other side, girls from Valencia Gardens began forming their own tight circles, watching how PHP operated while building their own approach to survival within their environment. That overlap created a situation where both sides were aware of each other, even before any formal rivalry took shape. By the late 1980s, the situation had reached a point where it was no longer just about individual disputes, since groups were starting to represent entire neighborhoods rather than just themselves. That shift made every interaction carry more weight, since what happened between two people could quickly extend to involve others who felt connected to the same space. The balance that existed before began shifting, since both sides were moving towards something more structured, even if it had not yet turned into open conflict. What started in Potrero Hill was already influencing how things developed across the city, especially in Valencia Gardens, where another group was beginning to take shape while watching everything closely. While Potrero Hill was building structure through PHP, Valencia Gardens on 15th and Valencia already had its own pressure, shaped by years of drug traffic moving through the Mission District long before the mid-80s boom changed everything. That complex sat right in a corridor where dealers clustered near the front lawns and entryways, while the interior pathways gave quick exits once police showed up or rivals started circling. People living there understood how movement worked just like in Potrero Hill, except the Mission had more outside traffic coming through daily, which made everything less contained and more unpredictable. By the time crack distribution started rising across the city, Valencia Gardens already had a system in place, even if it was mostly controlled by male crews tied to nearby sets. Women inside Valencia Gardens were not new to the game, since many had already been around the operations run by men connected to local groups along 16th Street, 24th Street, plus the BART corridor. They watched how product moved from one apartment to another, how money got collected, plus how disputes were handled when someone crossed a line, which meant they were learning the system without being given full access to it. Some stayed involved through relationships with men in the trade, while others handled smaller roles like storing product or acting as lookouts when movement increased. Over time, that same pattern seen in Potrero Hill started showing here, where women realized they were part of something bigger but not in control of it. Motivation for change did not come from one place, since different women in Valencia Gardens had their own reasons for stepping forward instead of staying in the background. Some saw how much money was moving through the projects and wanted their own share instead of depending on others, while others were focused on protection, especially after repeated incidents where girls were targeted without backup from male crews. Stories circulated about assaults, robberies, plus situations where disputes involving women were ignored or handled too late, which created a sense that relying on others was not enough. That mix of financial opportunity and personal safety pushed a group of young women toward organizing themselves in a way that matched what they were seeing across the city. By the late 1980s, that organization started taking shape as the Valencia Gardens Mob, often shortened to VG Mob, which became a recognized group inside the Mission with its own identity separate from the men operating in the same space. Unlike loose cliques that moved together casually, VG Mob formed with purpose, since members aligned themselves with the territory around 15th and Valencia, treating it as their base of operations rather than just a place to live. Their identity came from that location, which meant defending it became part of their responsibility, especially as outside groups started moving closer or testing boundaries. That independence mattered, since it showed they were not just supporting another crew, but building something that stood on its own. Structure inside VG Mob developed quickly, even if it did not follow the exact same model as PHP, since their environment required flexibility due to the constant flow of people through the Mission District. Loyalty became the main rule, with members expected to stand with each other in any situation, while breaking that trust could lead to consequences that ranged from being cut off to facing direct retaliation. Territory lines were understood without needing formal maps, since everyone knew which blocks belonged to Valencia Gardens, while movement beyond those areas required awareness of who might be watching. Communication stayed tight, often moving through word of mouth or direct contact, which helped them respond quickly when situations change. Their early reputation came from how they handled conflict, since VG Mob did not hesitate when challenged, responding fast in ways that made others take notice. Fights were not rare, especially around areas like Dolores Park, 16th Street, or bus stops where different groups crossed paths, which meant they had multiple chances to show how they operated under pressure. People started talking about how they moved in groups, how they backed each other without delay, plus how they were willing to escalate situations if they felt disrespected. That reputation spread across the mission, reaching nearby neighborhoods where their names started carrying weight even among those who had not dealt with them directly. First interactions with women from Potrero Hill were not immediately violent, since both sides were still figuring out how far they could move without triggering something bigger. Encounters happened at parties, school events, or shared public spaces where conversations sometimes turned tense but did not always lead to fights. Each side watched the other closely, paying attention to how they moved, who they moved with, plus how they responded when tested, which created a quiet form of competition before anything turned official. That stage was less about direct conflict and more about measuring strength, where both groups were learning what they were dealing with. Personal disputes started bridging the gap between individuals and groups, since arguments between two people could quickly pull others into the situation once loyalty came into play. Some conflicts came from relationships, including situations where someone was involved with a person from another neighborhood, which created tension that went beyond personal feelings and touched on territory. Others came from business, especially when products started moving between areas, leading to disagreements over who controlled certain spots or who had the right to sell there. These disputes did not always stay contained, since once word spread, others stepped in to support their side, turning small issues into something larger. One example that kept coming up in local stories involved a confrontation at a house party somewhere near the Mission around 1986, where a disagreement between a Potrero Hill girl and a Valencia Gardens girl turned physical after words were exchanged over access to drugs. What started as a slap between two individuals quickly drew in others, since both sides had backup nearby, which turned the situation into a full fight before it could be broken up. Nobody died that night, yet injuries were serious enough to leave marks that stayed visible long after, while pride took a hit that could not be ignored. That incident did not start the war, yet it showed how fast things could escalate once both groups were involved. As these moments stacked over time, tension between VG Mob and PHP grew more noticeable, even if it had not yet reached the level of open conflict that would define later years. Each new interaction added another layer, since unresolved issues stayed active instead of fading away, creating a buildup that affected how both sides moved daily. People in both neighborhoods started recognizing that something was forming, even if they could not fully explain it yet, since patterns were starting to show through repeated encounters. That shift meant the situation was no longer about isolated incidents, but about a growing divide between two groups that were becoming more organized. By the time 1987 approached, that divide had reached a point where it could not stay quiet much longer, since too many unresolved conflicts were sitting between the two sides, waiting for a trigger. Both groups had built enough structure to respond quickly, which meant any serious incident could push things into a new phase without warning. What started as tension shaped by environment, money, plus personal disputes was now moving towards something more defined, where sides would be chosen clearly instead of implied through smaller interactions. It did not take much after that point for one moment to shift everything, turning what had been building quietly into something that could not be ignored anymore. The moment that pushed everything forward did not come from a major operation or planned hit, since it started from something smaller that never got settled properly. Around 1986, at a house party near 15th Street in the Mission District, a confrontation broke out between a Potrero Hill girl, known on the block as Tiny Lisa, and a Valencia Gardens girl people called Roja. What began as a disagreement over access to drugs quickly turned physical once Lisa demanded free product and Roja refused, which led to a slap that landed in front of multiple witnesses. That single moment carried weight beyond the room, since both sides had people watching, while nobody stepped in to calm things down once pride got involved. When Lisa and her group walked out, they did not leave it behind, since word spread through Potrero Hill before the night even ended. The next day, That tension showed up in public instead of staying inside private spaces, since both sides crossed paths again near a playground close to 15th Street. This time there was no talking stage, since groups approached already expecting conflict, which meant fists came out first before anything else could happen. As the fight escalated, knives appeared, turning what might have ended as a simple brawl into something more serious that left visible injuries on both sides. Roja was reportedly cut during that encounter, while others walked away bruised or shaken, yet nobody went to the police since that would have brought different consequences. That moment did not end anything, since it created a situation where both sides felt they needed to respond again to avoid looking weak. Within weeks, retaliation became immediate rather than delayed, since groups started moving through known areas looking for each other instead of waiting for chance encounters. Parks like Dolores or Garfield Square turned into spaces where fights could break out without warning, while bus stops along 16th Street became points where individuals could be caught slipping if they were alone. These encounters were not random, since people were watching patterns, noting when someone left their block or who they moved with, which made it easier to plan where to strike. Violence stayed close range during this phase, since knives, bottles, plus bare hands were still the main tools used, making every encounter personal instead of distant. The first serious injuries came quickly once that pattern set in, since repeated fights increased the chances of someone getting hurt beyond recovery. One incident near Potrero Avenue involved a Valencia Gardens girl being jumped at a bus stop, where she was beaten with chains before being left on the ground until bystanders stepped in. In response, a few days later, a Potrero Hill girl was attacked near Shotwell Street, where she was dragged into an alley and cut multiple times before managing to escape. These events spread through both neighborhoods, reinforcing the idea that nobody was off limits once they stepped outside their immediate area. Each side began adjusting how they moved daily, avoiding certain routes or traveling in groups to reduce risk. The situation escalated further when firearms entered the picture, which shifted the tone from physical confrontations to something far more dangerous that could not be controlled once it started. Rumors circulated that a Valencia Gardens member known as Maya fired the first shot during an encounter near 18th Street, aiming at a Potrero Hill girl outside a store, although no one was hit during that incident. That action alone changed how both sides approached conflict, since it showed that the line between fighting and shooting had already been crossed. Shortly after, reports came from Potrero Hill residents about shots being fired into the air during a drive-through near Valencia Gardens, which was seen as a message rather than an attempt to hit anyone directly. Those early uses of guns were not about accuracy, since they were about signaling escalation to everyone involved. The first confirmed killing that pushed the situation beyond control came with the death of Danielle Brown, known in the mission as Shorty D, a 19-year-old affiliated with Valencia Gardens who was shot near 16th and Mission while leaving a liquor store. That incident happened sometime around 1986 or early 1987, although the exact date stayed unclear due to lack of official closure, which added to the tension instead of reducing it. Witnesses reported hearing multiple shots before seeing her collapse, while the shooter left before anyone could identify them clearly. Police opened an investigation, yet no arrest was made, which left the case unresolved and fueled speculation across both neighborhoods. Most people in Valencia Gardens believed the hit came from Potrero Hill, even without proof, which turned grief into motivation for retaliation. After Shorty D's death, things shifted from scattered incidents into something more organized, since VG Mob started marking their territory with graffiti that made their stance clear. Tags like VG Mob, or references to their block, appeared near 24th Street and along Mission corridors, signaling that they were not backing down from what had already started. Verbal threats became more direct, with members calling out PHP in public spaces or through word carried across neighborhoods, which made the divide visible instead of implied. On the other side, Potrero Hill responded by tightening their movement, reinforcing their own territory, plus preparing for whatever came next. At that point, both sides understood that this was no longer about individuals, since it had become about group identity tied to location. Retaliation started following a pattern where each incident connected directly to the last, creating a cycle that did not leave room for resolution. If someone was attacked on one side, the response came quickly from the other, often targeting someone connected to the same group rather than the original person involved. That approach made the conflict harder to stop, since it spread responsibility across entire groups instead of staying between individuals. Over time, incidents began stacking without any clear endpoint, since no side wanted to step back first, due to how that would be perceived. That mindset kept things moving forward, even when the original reasons were no longer the main focus. As the cycle continued, violence became more organized, since groups started planning encounters instead of relying on chance meetings to handle disputes. Ambushes began replacing spontaneous fights, with individuals being followed or tracked before being confronted in locations where escape would be difficult. One reported situation involved a VG Mob member being chased in a stolen vehicle near Cesar Chavez Street, where shots were fired after the car crashed, leaving her body later discovered with multiple gunshot wounds. While details around that incident stayed unclear, it reinforced the idea that the conflict had moved beyond street fights into something more structured. People involved were no longer reacting in the moment, since they were setting things up ahead of time. That shift changed how both neighborhoods experienced daily life, since the threat was no longer limited to specific locations or situations. Anyone connected to either side had to move carefully, watching surroundings constantly while avoiding predictable patterns that could make them a target. Families felt the pressure as well, since relatives of members were sometimes pulled into conflicts or used as leverage when tensions rose. Even those not directly involved understood that the situation had grown into something bigger than individual disputes, affecting how entire blocks operated. Over time, what started as conflict between two groups turned into a system that kept feeding itself, where each action created the next without needing a clear reason to continue. Once the conflict moved past early fights, the way it was carried out started changing, since both sides adjusted methods based on what had already happened on the streets. What began with fists, bottles, plus blades slowly shifted once firearms entered the mix around 1987 into the early 1990s, which made every encounter carry higher risk than before. Knives still played a role in close confrontations, especially in tight spaces like alleys or stairwells inside housing projects. Yet guns brought distance into situations that were once handled face to face. Small caliber pistols were the most common, often obtained through male connections or stolen during burglaries, which meant not everyone had access, but enough did to change the tone. Once that line was crossed, nobody could assume a fight would stay physical, which forced both sides to rethink how they approached every situation. As weapons evolved, tactics changed with them, since random encounters became less common compared to setups that involved planning ahead of time. Communication played a major role in this shift, since calls were made through landlines or early mobile devices to track where someone was or where they might be heading next. Spotters became important, with individuals watching for targets moving through known areas, then passing that information to others who could act on it quickly. That allowed groups to position themselves in advance, turning ordinary locations into places where ambushes could happen without warning. Instead of reacting to situations, both VG Mob and PHP started creating them, which made the conflict harder to predict from the outside. Public spaces stopped feeling neutral once these tactics became common. What used to be ordinary, shared areas for the entire community gradually transformed into potential battlegrounds, places where clear boundaries no longer existed and tension could flare up suddenly without any warning. Parks like Dolores or Garfield Square, which had long served as peaceful gathering spots for families, children playing, and neighbors relaxing on benches or grass, now witnessed repeated confrontations. Groups from opposing sides would meet there either by pure chance during normal daily activities or by deliberate arrangement, leading to fights that sometimes ended with serious injuries, ambulances, and a lingering atmosphere of fear that hung over the surrounding community for days afterward. Bus routes such as the 14 Mission Line also became especially risky. People from different neighborhoods had no choice but to share the same limited space for long stretches of the ride, sitting or standing close together, which meant conflicts could suddenly erupt mid-route. Heated arguments escalating quickly with raised voices and pushing before spilling out onto the streets once the bus reached its stop. Schools like Mission High or Balboa High were not exempt either. Students connected to either side often carried the tension with them into the hallways and classrooms during the day, where it sometimes boiled over into physical fights after school hours or even during lunch breaks in the cafeteria or yard. These locations mattered deeply because they forced daily, unavoidable interaction between rivals in places where people were supposed to feel safe and focused on learning or relaxing, creating repeated opportunities for conflict even when nobody had actively planned it in advance. Movement itself became a deliberate part of the strategy on both sides. Crossing into another group's territory was no longer just about getting from one place to another. It carried a clear message and carried real risk. When a VG Mob member walked through Potrero Hill without backup, it could be interpreted as a bold show of confidence or a reckless provocation, depending on who was watching and how it was perceived by those on the other side. Similarly, when PHP members moved through the Mission District, their presence alone sent a strong signal to everyone around them that they were not backing down. These actions were often intentional, carefully designed to test reactions, demonstrate strength, or simply show that they could move freely in areas where they were not expected to be. When nothing happened after such a crossing, it could boost confidence within the group and be seen as a small victory that spread through word of mouth. But if any kind of response came, even a verbal challenge, a dirty look, someone stepping forward, or a group starting to gather, the situation often escalated rapidly because both sides were already operating with high levels of alertness and deep distrust. Over time, these movements stopped being casual travel and turned into calculated positioning, where every step, every route chosen, and every appearance in certain blocks carried deeper meaning tied directly to the larger ongoing conflict. Male involvement stayed relatively limited in the direct physical confrontations between the two female groups. However, their presence still played an important behind-the-scenes role in shaping how the war was fought. Men connected to larger sets like the Black Gangster Disciples or other local mission crews sometimes provided access to weapons, vehicles for transportation, or safe locations where members could regroup after an incident without immediate risk. Their role was not to take leadership or direct operations. Both VG Mob and PHP maintained strong independence as female-led groups, but they influenced outcomes by supplying critical resources that made certain actions possible. In some cases, they also passed along useful information about rival movements or upcoming gatherings, which added another strategic layer to how encounters were planned or avoided. That relationship created a practical balance. The women ran their own operations and made their own decisions on the ground, while still being able to tap into existing male networks for support when the situation required it. As the conflict continued over the years, targeting became significantly more personal and far-reaching. It was no longer limited only to direct active members of each group, but extended to anyone connected to them through family ties, friendships, or even casual association. Relatives, close friends, and individuals who were simply present during certain situations could suddenly find themselves pulled into the violence. One reported case involved a sister of a PHP member being attacked near Shotwell Street after she was identified purely through her family connection rather than any direct involvement in the conflict. In response, a VG Mob affiliate was later targeted near Potrero Avenue under similar circumstances. This expanding pattern made it increasingly difficult for anyone even loosely linked to either side to feel completely safe, since simple proximity or association could be enough to bring unwanted and dangerous attention at any time. That level of targeting had a profound effect on daily life across both neighborhoods. People began making careful adjustments to their routines in order to avoid situations that could turn dangerous without warning. Walking alone became much less common, especially for those known to have any affiliation with either side. Routes to school, work, or the store were chosen with extra caution to reduce exposure to risky areas. Families started paying much closer attention to who their children associated with, fully understanding that certain friendships or connections could lead to consequences that reach far beyond personal relationships. Even those not directly involved learned to recognize early warning signs of tension, such as groups gathering unexpectedly on a corner, sudden changes in normal movement patterns across familiar streets, or an unusual quietness in areas that were normally busy. This constant state of awareness created an environment where everyday activities carried an underlying sense of risk that rarely went away completely, affecting how people lived, worked, and moved through their own neighborhoods. Law enforcement in San Francisco did not fully recognize the scale of female gang activity until much later. Early cases like the killing of Danielle Shorty D. Brown remained unresolved, as police focus in the 1990s stayed mainly on male gangs, leaving female conflicts underdocumented. This lack of early response allowed the patterns to carry forward. By 2003, the Hill Girls in Potrero Hill became visible, with officers Lynn Broberg and Tony Chaplin linking at least 15 violent incidents in 6 months, including bat, knife, and ambush attacks, showing that the mid-'80s structure had not disappeared but continued in new forms. At the same time, redevelopment in neighborhoods like Valencia Gardens demolished old housing projects and displaced families to places like Oakland, Antioch, and Sacramento. This broke up the physical spaces of the conflict but did not erase years of built-up violence and survival decisions. Many faced incarceration, trauma, or loss, while later cases like Andrea Dreye Browner's role in the 2018 Athens killings showed how the pattern evolved. The moment on 16th Street was not random. It was part of a cycle that continued shifting rather than ending.